and it's Chapter 7, Nightmare. I told Charlie I had a lot of homework to do and that I didn't want anything to eat. There was a basketball game on that he was excited about, though of course I had no idea what was so special about it, so he wasn't aware of anything unusual in my face or tone. Once in my room, I locked the door, dug through my desk and found my old headphones, then plugged them into my little CD player. I picked up a CD that Phil had given to me for Christmas. It was one of his favourite bands, but they used a little too much bass and shrieking for my tastes. I popped it into place and lay down on my bed. I put on the headphones, hit play, and turned up the volume until it hurt my ears. I closed my eyes, but the light still intruded, so I added a pillow on the top half of my face. I concentrated very carefully on the music, trying to understand the lyrics, to unravel the complicated drum patterns. By the third time I'd listened through the CD, I knew all the words to all the choruses at least. I was surprised to find that I really did like the band after all, once I got past the blaring noise. I'd have to thank Phil again, and it worked. The shattering beats made it impossible for me to think, which was the whole purpose of the exercise. I listened to the CD again and again until I was singing along with all the songs, until, finally, I was asleep. I opened my eyes to a familiar place, aware of some corner of my consciousness that I was dreaming. I recognized the green light of the forest. I could hear the waves crashing against the rocks somewhere nearby, and I knew that I'd find the ocean. I'd be able to see the sun. I was trying to follow the sound, but then Jacob Black was there, tugging on my hand, pulling me back towards the blackest part of the forest. "Jacob, what's wrong?" I asked. His face was frightened as he yanked me with all his strength against my resistance. I didn't want to go into the dark. "Run, Bella, you have to run," he whispered, terrified. "This way, Bella." I recognized Mike's voice, calling out of the gloomy heart of the trees, but I couldn't see him. "Why?" I asked, still pulling against Jacob's grasp, desperate now to find the sun. But Jacob let go of my hand and yelped, suddenly shaking, falling to the dim forest floor. He twitched on the ground as I watched in horror. "Jacob!" I screamed. But he was gone. In his place was a large red-brown wolf with black eyes. The wolf faced away from me, pointing towards the shore. The hair on the back of his shoulders bristled, low growls issuing from between his exposed fangs. "Bella, run!" Mike cried out from behind me. But I didn't turn. I was watching a light coming toward me from the beach, and then Edward stepped out of the trees, his skin faintly glowing, his eyes black and dangerous. He held up one hand and beckoned me to come to him. The wolf growled at my feet. I took a step forward, toward Edward. He smiled again, and his teeth were sharp, pointed. "Trust me," he purred. I took another step. The wolf launched himself across the space between me and the vampire, fangs aiming for the jugular. "No!" I screamed, wrenching upright out of my bed. My sudden movement caused the headphones to pull from the CD player, uh, pull, uh, to pull the CD player off the bedside table and clatter to the wooden floor. My light was still on, and I was sitting fully dressed on the bed with shoes on. I glanced, disorientated, at the clock on my dresser. 5:30 in the morning. I groaned, fell back, and rolled over onto my face, kicking off my boots. I was too uncomfortable to get anywhere near sleep, though. I rolled back over and unbuttoned my jeans, yanking them off awkwardly as I tried to stay horizontal. I could feel the braid in my hair, an uncomfortable ridge along my back, on the back of my skull. I turned onto my side and ripped the rubber band out quickly, combing through the plaits with my fingers. I pulled the pillow back over my eyes. It was all no use, of course. My subconscious had dragged up exactly the images I'd been trying so desperately to avoid. I was going to have to face them now. I sat up. My head spun for a moment as the blood flowed downwards. First things first, I thought to myself, happy to put it off as long as possible. I grabbed my bathroom bag. The shower didn't last nearly as long as I had hoped it would, though, even taking the time to blow dry my hair. I was soon out of things to do in the bathroom. Wrapped in a towel, I crossed back to my room. I couldn't tell if Charlie was still asleep or if he'd left already. I went to look out my window, and the cruiser was gone, fishing again. I dressed slowly in my most comfy sweats, and then made my bed, something I never did. I couldn't put it off any longer. I went to my desk. I switched on my old computer. I hated using internet here. My modem was sadly outdated, my free service substandard. Just dialing up took that long. I decided to get myself a bowl of cereal while I waited. I ate slowly, chewing each bite with care. When I was done, I washed the bowl and spoon and dried them and put them back away. My feet dragged as I climbed the stairs. I went to my CD player first, picking it off the floor, placing it carefully back in the center of the table. I pulled out the headphones and put them back in my desk drawer. Then I turned the same CD on, turning it down to the point where it was in the background. With another sigh, I turned to my computer. Naturally, the screen was covered in pop-up ads. I sat in my hard folding chair and began closing all the little windows. Eventually, I made it to my favorite search engine. I shot down a few more pop-ups and then typed in one word: vampire. It took an infuriatingly long time, of course. When the results came up, there was a lot to shift through. Everything from movies and TV shows to role-playing games, underground metal and goth cosmetic companies. And then I found a promising site: vampires, A to Z. I waited patiently for it to load, quickly clicking closed each ad that had flashed across my screen. And finally, the screen was finished. A simple white background with black text, academic looking. Two quotes greeted me on the home page. Throughout the vast, shadowy world of ghosts and demons, there is no figure so terrible, so dreaded and abhorred, yet dight with such fearful fascination as vampire, who is himself neither ghost nor demon, who but yet who partakes in dark natures and possesses the mysterious and terrible qualities of both. Reverend Montague Summers. If there is in this world a well-attested account, it is that of vampires. Nothing is lacking. Official reports, affidavits of well-known people, of surgeons, of priests, of magistrates. The judicial proof is almost complete. And with all that, who is there who believes in vampires? Russell. The rest of the site was an alphabetized listing of the different myths of vampires held throughout the world. The first I clicked on, the Dang, was a Filipino vampire, supposedly responsible for planting taro on the islands long ago. The myth continued that the Dang worked with humans for many years, but the partnership ended one day when a woman cut her finger and a Dang sucked her wound, enjoying the taste so much that it drained her completely of blood. I read carefully through the descriptions, looking for anything that sounded familiar, let alone plausible. It seemed that most vampire myths centered around beautiful women as demons and children as victims, but also seemed like constructs created to explain away the high mortality rates for young children and to give men an excuse for infidelity. Many of the stories involved bodiless spirits and warnings against improper burials. There wasn't much that sounded like the movies that I'd seen, and only very few like the Hebrew Esther and the Polish Apure, who were even preoccupied with drinking blood. Oh, lads, there's more. There's more words that I haven't practiced pronouncing. We'll get there together. Only three entities really caught my attention. The Romanian Farah, a powerful undead who could appear as a beautiful pale-skinned human. The Slovak Nalapsi, a creature strong and fast. It could massacre an entire village in a single hour after midnight. And one other, lads, the Strengoni Benefici. About this last, there was only one brief sentence. Strengoni Benefici, an Italian vampire, said to be on the side of goodness and a mortal enemy of all evil vampires. It was a relief that that one small entry, that one myth among hundreds, had claimed there was good in the existence of vampires. Overall, though, there was little that coincided with Jacob's stories or my own observations. I made a little catalogue of my mind, and I'd read carefully and compared each myth. Speed, strength, beauty, pale skin, eyes that shifted colour, and then Jacob's criteria: blood drinkers, enemies of the werewolf, cold-skinned and immortal. There are very few myths that matched even one factor. And then another problem, one that I'd remembered from a small number of scary movies I'd seen, was backed up by today's reading. Vampires couldn't come out in the daytime. The sun would burn them to a cinder. They slept in coffins all day and only came out at night. Aggravated, I snapped off the computer's main power switch, not wanting to shut things down properly. Though my irritation, I felt overwhelming embarrassment. It was all so stupid. I was sitting in my room, researching vampires. What was wrong with me? I decided that most of the blame belonged on the doorstep of the town of Forks, and the entire sodden Olympic Peninsula for that matter. I had to get out of this house, but there was nowhere I wanted to go that didn't involve a 3-day drive. I pulled on my boots anyway, unclear where I was headed, and went downstairs. I shrugged into my raincoat without checking the weather and stomped out the door. It was overcast, but not raining yet. I ignored my truck and started east on foot, angling across Charlie's yard toward the ever-encroaching forest. It didn't take long until I was deep enough for the house and the road to be invisible, but for the only sound to be the squish of the damp earth under my feet and the sudden cries of the jays. There was a thin ribbon of a trail that led through the forest here, or I wouldn't risk wandering on my own like this. My sense of direction is hopeless. I could get lost in much less helpful surroundings. The trail wound deeper and deeper into the forest, mostly east, as far as I could tell. It snaked around the Sitka spruces and the hemlocks and the yews and the maples. I only vaguely knew the names of the trees around me, and all that I knew was due to Charlie pointing them out to me from the cruiser window in the earlier days. There were many I didn't know, and others that I couldn't be sure about because they were so covered in green parasites. I followed the trail as long as my anger at myself pushed me forward. As it started to ebb, I slowed. A few drops of moisture trickled from the canopy above me. I couldn't be certain if it was beginning to rain or if it was simply pools left over from yesterday, held high in the tree leaves above me, slowly dripping their way back to earth. A recently fallen tree. I knew it was recent because it wasn't entirely carpeted in moss. It rested against the trunk of one of her sisters, creating a sheltered little bench, just a few feet off the trail. I stepped over the ferns carefully, making sure my jacket was between the damp seat and my clothes. Whenever they touched, I leaned my hooded head back against the living tree. This was the wrong place to have come. I should have known. But where else was there to go? The forest was deep green, and far too much like a scene from last night's dream to allow for peace of mind. Now there was no longer any sound of my soggy footsteps. The silence was piercing. The birds were quiet too. The drops increased in frequency, so it must be raining above. Ferns stood higher than my head, now when I was seated, and I knew someone could walk along by that path 3 feet away and not see me. Here in the trees, it's much easier to believe in the absurdities that embarrassed me indoors. Nothing had changed in this forest for thousands of years, and all the myths and legends of 100 different lands seemed much more likely in this green haze than they had in my clean-cut bedroom. I forced myself to focus on the two most vital questions I had to answer, but I did so unwillingly. First, I had to decide if it was possible that what Jacob had said about the Cullens could be true. Immediately my mind responded with a resounding negative. It was silly and morbid to entertain such ridiculous notions. But what then? I asked myself. There was no rational explanation for how I was alive at the moment. I listened again, in my head the things I had observed for myself, the impossible speed and strength, the shifting eye colour from black to gold and black again, inhuman beauty, the pale, frigid skin, and more. Small things that registered slowly, like how they never seemed to eat, the disturbing grace they moved with, the way he spoke, sometimes, with unfamiliar cadences and phrases that better fit the style of turn-of-the-century novel than of a 21st century classroom. He'd skipped class the day we'd done blood typing. He hadn't said no to the beach trip until he'd heard where we were going. He seemed to know that everyone around him was thinking, except me. And he told me he was the villain. Dangerous. Could the Cullens be vampires? Well, they were something. Something outside the possibility of rational justification was taking place in front of my incredulous eyes. Whether it could be Jacob's cold ones or my own superhero theory, Edward Cullen was not human. He was something more. So then, maybe that would have to be my answer for now. And then the most important question of all, what was I going to do if it was true? If Edward was a vampire, I could hardly make myself think out the words. Well, then what should I do? Involving someone else was definitely out. I couldn't even believe myself. Anyone I told would have me committed. The only two options seemed practical. The first was to take his advice, be smart, to avoid him as much as possible, to cancel our plans, to go back to ignoring him as far as I was able, to pretend that there was impenetrably thick glass between us in the one class that we were forced to together, to tell him to leave me alone, and mean it this time. I was gripped by a sudden agony of despair as I considered that alternative. My mind rejected the pain, quickly skipping on to the next option. I could do something different. After all, if he was something sinister, he'd done nothing to hurt me so far. In fact, I would be a dent in Tyler's fender if he hadn't acted so quickly. So quickly, I argued with myself, that it might have been sheer reflexes. But if it was a reflex to save lives, well, how bad could he be? I retorted. My head spun in answerless circles. There was one thing I was sure of, if I was sure of anything. The dark Edward in my dream last night was only a reflection of my fear of the word Jacob had spoken, not Edward himself. Even so, when I had screamed out in terror at the werewolf's lunge, it wasn't in fear for the wolf that had brought out the cry of "no" to my lips. It was the fear that he would be harmed. Even as he called to me with sharp-edged fangs, I'd feared for him. And I knew in that I had my answer. I didn't know if it was ever even a choice, really. I was already in too deep. Now that I knew, if I knew, I could do nothing about my frightening secret. because when I thought of him, of his voice, his hypnotic eyes, the magnetic force of his personality, I wanted nothing more to be with him right now, than to be with him right now. Even if, but I couldn't think it, not here alone in this darkening forest, not while the rain made it dim as twilight under the canopy and patterned like footsteps across the matted earthen floor. I shivered and rose quickly from my place of concealment, worried that somehow the path would have disappeared with the rain. But it was there, safe and clear, winding its way out of the green maze. I followed it hastily, my hood pulled close around my face, becoming surprised, as I ran through the trees, how far I'd come. I started to wonder if I was heading out at all, or following the path further into the confines of the forest. Before I could get too panicky, though, I began to glimpse some open spaces through the webbed branches, and I could hear a car passing on the street, and I was free. Charlie's lawn stretched out in front of me, the house beckoning me, promising warmth and dry socks. It was just noon when I got back inside. I went upstairs and got dressed for the day, jeans and a t-shirt, and since I was staying indoors, I didn't make too much effort to concentrate on my task for the day. A paper on Macbeth that was due on Wednesday. I settled to outlining a rough draft contentedly, um, more serene than I'd felt since Thursday morning, if I was being honest. Well, that had always been my way, though. Making decisions was a painful part for me, the part I agonized over, but once the decision was made, I simply followed through, usually with a relief that the choice was made. Sometimes the relief was tainted by despair, like my decision to come to Forks, but it was still better than wrestling with the alternatives. This decision was ridiculously easy to live with, dangerously easy. And so the day was quiet, productive. I finished my paper before 8. Charlie came home with a large catch, and I made a mental note to pick up a book for recipes for fish when I was in Seattle next week. The chills that flashed up my spine whenever I thought of that trip were no different from the ones I'd felt before I'd taken the walk with Jacob Black. This should be different, I thought. I should be afraid. I knew I should be, but I couldn't feel that right kind of fear. I slept dreamlessly that night, exhausted from beginning the day so early and sleeping so poorly the night before. I woke up for a second time since arriving in Forks to a bright yellow light of a sunny day. I skipped to the window, stunned to see that there was hardly a cloud in the sky, and those were just fleecy little white puffs that couldn't possibly be carrying any rain. I opened the window, surprised when it slid open silently without sticking, not having opened it in who knows how many years, and sucked in a relatively dry air. It was nearly warm and hardly windy at all. My blood was electric in my veins. Charlie was finishing breakfast when I came downstairs, and he picked up on my mood immediately. "Nice day out," he commented. "Yes," I say with a grin. He smiled back, his brown eyes crinkling around the edges. When Charlie smiled, it's easier to see why he and my mother had jumped too quickly into an early marriage. Most of the young romantic he'd been back in those days had faded before I'd known him, as the curly brown hair, of the same colour, if not the same texture as mine, had dwindled slowly, revealing more and more shiny skin on his forehead. But when he smiled, I could see a little of the man who had run away with Renee when she was just 2 years older than I was now. I ate breakfast cheerfully, watching the dust motes stirring in the sunlight that streamed in the back window. Charlie called out a goodbye, and I heard the cruiser pull away from the house. I hesitated on my way out the door, hand on my rain jacket. It would be a tempting fate to leave it home. With a sigh, I folded it over my arm and stepped out into the brightest light I'd seen in months. By dint of much elbow grease, I was able to get both windows in the truck completely open and rolled down. I was one of the first ones to school. I hadn't even checked the clock in my hurry to get outside. I parked and headed toward the seldom used picnic benches to the south side of the cafeteria. The benches were still a little damp, so I sat on my jacket, glad to have a use for it. My homework was done, the product of a slow social life, but there were a few trig problems I wasn't sure I had right. I took up my book industriously, but halfway through checking the first problem, I was daydreaming, watching the sunlight play on the red barked trees. I sketched inattentively along the margins of my homework. After a few minutes, I realized I'd drawn 5 pairs of dark eyes staring out of the page at me. I scrubbed them all out with an eraser. "Bella!" I heard someone call, and it sounded like Mike. I looked around to realize that the school had become populated while I'd been sitting there, absent-minded. Everyone was in t-shirts, some even in shorts, although the temperature couldn't have been over 60. Mike was coming toward me in khaki shorts and a striped rugby shirt, waving. "Hey, Mike," I called, waving back, unable to be half-hearted on a morning like this. He came to sit by me, the tidy spikes of his hair shining golden in the light, his grin stretching across his face. He was so delighted to see me, I couldn't help but feel gratified. "I never noticed before. Your hair has red in it," he commented, catching between his fingers a strand that was fluttering in the light breeze. "Only in the sun." It became a little uncomfortable as he tucked a lock behind my ear. "Great day, isn't it?" "My kind of day," I agreed. "What did you do yesterday?" His tone was a bit too proprietary. "I mostly worked on my essay." I didn't add that I was finished with it. No need to sound smug. He hit his forehead with the heel of his hand. "Oh yeah, that's due Thursday, right?" Wednesday, I think." "Wednesday?" He frowned. "That's not good. What are you writing on yours?" "Whether Shakespeare's treatment of the female characters is misogynistic." He stared at me as if I'd just spoken in pig Latin. "I guess I'll have to get to work on that tonight," he said, deflated. "I was going to ask you if you wanted to go out." "Oh," I said, taken off guard. Why couldn't I ever have a pleasant conversation with Mike anymore without it getting awkward? "Well, we could go out to dinner or something, and I could work on it later." He smiled hopefully. "Mike," I hated being put on the spot, "I don't think that would be the best idea." His face fell. "Why?" he asked, his eyes guarded. My thoughts flicked to Edward, wondering if that's where his thoughts were at as well. "I think, and if you ever repeat what I'm saying here now, I will cheerfully beat you to death," I threatened. "But I think that would hurt Jessica's feelings." He was bewildered, obviously not thinking in that direction at all. "Jessica? Really, Mike, are you blind?" "Oh," he exhaled, clearly dazed. I took advantage of that to make my escape. "It's time for class, and I can't be late again." I gathered my books up and stuffed them in my bag. We walked in silence to Building 3, and his expression was distracted. I hoped whatever thoughts he had, or whatever he was immersed in, were leading him in the right direction. When I saw Jessica intrigue, she was bubbling with enthusiasm. She, Angela, and Lauren were going to Port Angeles tonight to go dress shopping for the dance, and she wanted me to come too, even if I didn't need one. I was indecisive. It would be nice to get out of town with some girlfriends, but Lauren would be there, and who knew what I could be doing tonight. But that was definitely the wrong path to let my mind wander down. Of course I was happy about the sunlight, but that wasn't completely responsible for the euphoric mood I was in, not even close. So I gave her a maybe, telling her I'd have to talk to Charlie first. She talked of nothing but the dance on the way to Spanish, continuing as if without interruption when the class finally ended. 5 minutes late. and we were on our way to lunch. I was far too lost in my own frenzy of anticipation to notice much of what she said. I was painfully eager to see not just him, but all the Cullens, to compare them with the new suspicions that had plagued my mind. As I crossed the threshold of the cafeteria, I felt the first true tingle of fear slither down my spine and settle in my stomach. Would they be able to know what I was thinking? And then a different feeling jolted around me. Would Edward be wanting to sit with me again? As was my routine, I glanced towards the Cullens table, and a shiver of panic trembled in my stomach as I realized it was empty. With dwindling hope, my eyes scoured the rest of the cafeteria, hoping to find him alone, waiting for me, but the place was nearly filled. Spanish had made us late, but there was no sign of Edward or his family. Desolation hit me with crippling strength. I shambled along behind Jessica, not bothering to pretend to listen any more. We were late enough that everyone had already, or was already at our table. I avoided the empty chair next to Mike in favour of one by Angela. I vaguely noticed that Mike held his chair out politely for Jessica, and that her face lit up in response. Angela asked a few quiet questions about the Macbeth paper, which I answered as naturally as I could, while spiralling downward in misery. She, too, invited me to go along with them tonight, and I agreed now, gasping at anything to distract myself. Sorry, do you know what it is? As the books go on, I get my... it's quite tiring, actually, to speak. Uh, so it's like, I'm trying not to slur my words, but we'll try that again. She, too, invited me to go with them tonight, and I agreed now, grasping at anything to distract myself. I realised I'd been holding on to the last shred of hope when I entered biology and saw his empty seat, and felt a new wave of disappointment. The rest of the day passed slowly, dismally. In gym we had a lecture on the rules of badminton, the next torture they had lined up for me. But at least it meant I got to sit and listen instead of stumbling around on the court. The best part was that the coach didn't finish, so I got another day off tomorrow. Never mind the day after they would arm me with a racket before unleashing me on the rest of the class. I was glad to leave campus, so I'd be free to pout and mope before I went out with Jessica and company. But right after I walked in the door of Charlie's house, Jessica called to cancel our plans. I tried to be happy that Mike had asked her out to dinner. I really was relieved that he'd finally seemed to be catching on, but my enthusiasm sounded false in my own ears. She rescheduled her shopping trip for tomorrow night, which left me little in the way of distractions. I had fish marinating for dinner, with a salad and bread left over from the night before, so there was nothing to do there. I spent a focused half an hour on homework, but then I got through that too. I checked my email, reading the backlog of letters from my mother, getting snippier as they progressed to the present. I sighed and typed a quick response. Mum, sorry I've been out. I went to the beach with some friends and had to write a paper. My excuses were fairly pathetic, so I gave up on that. It's sunny out today. I know. I'm shocked too. So I'm going outside to soak up as much vitamin D as I can. I love you. Bella. I decided to kill an hour with a non-school related reading. I had a small collection of books that came with me to Forks, the shabbiest volume in the compilation of works of Jane Austen. I selected one and headed to the backyard, grabbing a ragged old quilt from the linen cupboard at the top of the stairs on the way down. Outside in Charlie's small, square yard, I folded the quilt in half and um, laid it out of the reach of the tree's shadows on the thick lawn that would always be slightly wet, no matter how the sun shone. I lay on my stomach, crossing my ankles in the air, flipping through the different novels in the book, trying to decide which would occupy my mind the most thoroughly. My favourites were Pride and Prejudice and Sense and Sensibility. I'd read the first most recently, so I started Sense and Sensibility, only to remember that after chapter 3 that the hero of the story happened to be named Edward. Angrily, I turned to Mansfield Park, but the hero of that piece is named Edmund, and that's just a bit too close. Weren't any other names available in the late 18th century? I snapped the book shut, annoyed, and rolled over onto my back. I pushed my sleeves up as high as they would go and closed my eyes. I would think of nothing but the warmth on my skin, I told myself severely. The breeze was still light, but it blew tendrils of my hair around my face, and that tickled a bit. I pulled all my hair over my head, letting it fan out like a quilt above me, and focused again on the heat that touched my eyelids, my cheekbones, my nose, my lips, my forearms, my neck, and soaked through my light shirt. The next thing I was conscious of was the sound of Charlie's cruiser turning into the bricks of the driveway. I sat up in surprise, realizing the light had gone behind the trees and I'd fallen asleep. I looked around, muddled, with a sudden feeling that I wasn't alone. "Charlie?" I asked, but I could hear the door slamming in front of the house. I jumped up, foolishly, edgy, gathering the now damp quilt and my book. I ran to get some oil and heating on the stove, realizing that dinner would be late. Charlie was hanging up his gun belt and stepping out of his boots when I came in. "Sorry, Dad, dinner's not ready yet. I fell asleep outside." I stifled a yawn. "Don't worry about it," he said. "I wanted to catch the score on the game anyway." I watched TV with Charlie after dinner for something to do. There wasn't anything on I wanted to watch, but he knew I didn't like baseball, so we turned to some mindless sitcom that neither of us enjoyed. He seemed happy, though, to be doing something together, and it felt good, despite my depression, to make him happy. "Dad," I said during a commercial, "Jessica and Angela are going to look for dresses for the dance tomorrow night in Port Angeles, and they want me to help them choose. Do you mind if I go with them?" "Jessica Stanley?" he asked. "And Angela Weber," I sighed, as if I gave him as I gave him the details. He was confused. "But you're not going to the dance, right?" "No, Dad, but I'm helping them find dresses. You know, giving them constructive criticism." I wouldn't have to explain this to a woman. "Well, okay." He seemed to realize he was out of his depth with the girly stuff. "It's a school night, though. We'll leave right after school, so we can get back early. Or, yeah, so we can get back early. You'll be okay for dinner, right?" "Bells, I fed myself for 17 years before you got here," he reminded me. "I don't know how you survived," I muttered, then added more clearly. "I'll leave some things for cold cut sandwiches in the fridge, okay? Right on top." It was sunny again in the morning. I awakened with renewed hope that I grimly tried to suppress. I dressed for the warmer weather in a deep blue v-neck blouse, something I'd worn in the dead of winter in Phoenix. I had planned my arrival at school so that I'd barely had time to make it to class. With a sinking heart, I circled the full lot, looking for a space, while also searching for the silver Volvo that was clearly not there. I parked in the last row and hurried to English, arriving breathless but subdued before the final bell. It was the same as yesterday. I just couldn't keep little sprouts of hope from budding in my mind, only to have them squashed painfully as I entered the lunchroom in vain and sat at my empty biology table. The Port Angeli scheme came back on. Oh, what a bad boy. Right, we'll finish this quickly. There's not long left. Back on for tonight, but made all the more attractive by the fact that Lauren had other obligations. I was anxious to get out of town so I could stop, glancing over my shoulder, hoping to see him appearing out of the blue as he always did. I vowed to myself that I'd be in a good mood tonight and not ruin Angela or Jessica's enjoyment of dress hunting. Oh, what an absolute fluffy fool. My poor phone. Maybe I could do a little shopping as well. I refused to think that I might be shopping alone in Seattle this weekend, no longer interested in the earlier arrangement. Surely he wouldn't cancel without at least telling me. After school, Jessica followed me home in her white Mercury so I could ditch my books and truck. I brushed through my hair quickly when I was inside, feeling a slight lift of excitement as I contemplated getting out of Forks. I left a note for Charlie on the table, explaining again where to find dinner, switching my scruffy wallet from my school bag to a purse that I rarely used, and ran out to join Jessica. We went to Angela's house next, and she was waiting for us. My excitement increased exponentially when we drove out of the town limits. And that's the end of chapter 7. My poor phone. And I will get this uploaded on Wednesday, as usual. And thanks again.